This Quoircast podcast is brought to you by Ideas Digest. I'm Conrad.
And I'm Matt.
Each week, two optimistic Aussie blokes explore new and challenging ideas outside of our echo chamber on our totally realistic quest to achieve world peace, maybe some personal enlightenment. Is that too much of an oversell?
No, just roll the montage.
Okay.
I'm right and you're wrong.
What are you talking about? Straight men enjoy gay sex. What?
The Bible is extremely pro-abortion.
Why the hell should I trust you now?
Don't define me by what I do in bed.
Do you think that kick us out?
I've done psychedelics 150 times in my life.
You still choose to ejaculate to that.
Oh my God.
You can have a wife and a girlfriend.
This guy just gets your face.
Rubs that in. Break your bias. Each week, anywhere you get your podcast, tune in. It's going to be an amazing time.
Amazing.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Hit the button, hit the button. It's time for the podcast. I need to come up with a theme song, John. This is not church, because if it was, you would have left by now. Hello, everybody. We have the tagline of the show now is this is not church, but we digress.
Oh, is that what it is?
What do you think? Sure, I don't know.
That works for me.
We
What was
change
the
it
other
around
one?
every time. No, my current favorite one is this is not church, because if it was, you'd have left by now.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. And it can't be the church. We haven't even passed an offering plate. So there's no way this could be church.
That's true.
There's no way. Although I'm open to the idea of a virtual passing of the plate. So if you would like for the Lord to bless you, folks, sow seed into our ministry, and God will bless you sevenfold. I guarantee.
Yes.
Money back guarantee, John?
Yes.
Are we offering the money back guarantee yet?
Money back guarantee. Money
Yes, so
back
God-
guarantee.
Yes. So just sow seeds into the ministry.
But there is a caveat. You
Of
have to
course.
prove that you had enough faith. Because if you didn't have enough faith, then it's on you, not on us.
So if they just prove with their receipts that they sowed into the ministry. Oh, but it has to. Okay, I got you. All right, so we're not cynical or nothing.
No.
So we are. Listen, we're back with another episode. My name is Nat Turney. I'm with my older brother John. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
And we're about ready to jump into a brand new, fresh conversation with a new friend of ours. This is Dana Robert Hicks. Let me get something up on his bio for you real quick, and we'll jump into what I hope to be a really good and interesting conversation. If it has anything to do with him, I'm sure it will. If it's left up to John and me, it's a crapshoot, man.
Yeah, yeah, really is. Really is.
There we go. Sorry, Dr. Dana Robert Hicks. Don't want to forget the honorific, because that's a whole lot of hard work and you earned it. So Dr. Dana Robert Hicks is an Amazon best-selling author and has contributed to more than five books and many articles that revolve around the themes of culture, change, church planting, and mission. Before his retirement from professional ministry, he was a church planter, pastor, professor, and leadership developer for over 30 years. His book is entitled The Knot, and it has a subtitle that I didn't write down. Maybe you can tell us what the subtitle of that is.
Yeah. How to secure healthy modern relationships while not being tied to marriage's past.
Nice. Cool. So if you don't mind, John and I like to start conversations off just by kind of getting a little bit of people's background spiritually, theologically, whatever. Just kind of give us a rundown of what makes you tick that way.
Yeah. I grew up in a real conservative evangelical environment. My father was a minister in a small holiness denomination, and I followed in his footsteps and was part of that denomination for 25 years as well, ministering in several states, did the youth pastor gig, did the senior pastor gig, did the church planning thing, kind of all around the West Coast. And then, it was grew increasingly difficult to hide my cognitive dissonance from everyone.
Amen.
And so I thought maybe I'd try a swipe at the Methodists, as I went to the Methodist camp for a while and found out I was trading one set of problems for another, and the grass wasn't as green as I thought it would be. And so decided to retire from ministry. And so I've been, doing some work in real estate and insurance and things like that to kind of put food on the table. But what I discovered, kind of stumbled into, was realizing that when the church doesn't pay your salary, you can kind of say what you really think. And, so that's been fun. And so this book is kind of a product of that, of everything really I wanted to say about marriage, but kind of felt like if I did, they might tar and feather me. So
yeah, I think that's been a lot of our experience has been like, listen, if I said everything that was on my mind, I would be fired, first of all, in no short order. And then probably would damage a lot of relationships along the way. So, the funny thing is though, like you said, though, I resonate with what you said about cognitive dissonance, because at some point that becomes intolerable, right? Like it seems like everyone has their own threshold for how much of that they can put up with. But everyone, I think most people have a breaking point. And mine came when it came to issues of LGBTQ community and how we treated them, even to how we were treating people with addiction problems and, sort of giving them a bunch of glib cliches versus offering actual help. Like I just couldn't find myself staying there anymore. And the more outspoken I was, the more problems I created. So I left, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And that was a big issue for me as well, among others. But yeah, the LGBT stuff. And yeah, at some point, I tell people, it's sort of like, and actually the whole Trump thing was kind of a big thing as well. When that all went down, I remember telling somebody, if it was the 1950s and I wanted to join a country club and they wouldn't, let African Americans join, I wouldn't join the country club out of conscience, and I thought, at what point do you say, to the organization, you're doing more harm than good? And I'm not sure it's in good conscience I can even stay here, being associated with you, even though I'm trying to be a voice for change in this, So that was kind of where I finally landed on it. So
I did that same sort of dance where I'm like, I tried. I really did. I think I gave it an honest try to push for change from within, be the voice of dissent from within, because I was still very much felt connected to the institution and felt it was fixable. And it might still be. Maybe someone else needs to be, but I just couldn't. I'm with you. Like the Trump stuff surprised me, and it probably shouldn't have. In retrospect, it shows more of my naivete than anything else. But I hadn't seen in my own church experience up to that point, I hadn't seen it on full display until that. Yeah. And then I'm like, whoa, okay, you guys have been here all along, but holy shit, now you're showing all of your true colors. And it got ugly in a real quick hurry. So, there was, that was a big eye opener. And Trump, I think, gave people he more than anything gave people permission to say out loud what they've been saying inside for a very long time.
Right.
I would agree. I mean, I think those people have always been there, but someone like Trump has given them permission to speak out loud their homophobia, their racist rants, their whatever, their honestly anti-American
nationalism.
Their white nationalism, their ultra right, religious right rhetoric. It gave them permission to come out of the dark.
Yep.
And stand in their version, and it's in quotes, their version
and still stay solidly inside of their own understanding of what it means to be a Christian, which was always very strange to me. But we digress.
There we go.
You told me you were going to, so I'm not disappointed at all.
Yeah, we do. Hey, so while you were inside of the Methodist Church, and I'm not sure how long it's been since you left that organization, but were you privy to some of because I know there's a lot of internal turmoil in that church right now over these issues, right?
Right.
My friends who are Methodist are like, it's not a matter of if, but when that church splits. They're going to split. And
it's gonna happen.
It's gonna happen. So were you inside of that when some of that was roiling, or had you gotten out before then?
I was so new to the denomination that I wasn't an insider by any means, but I was privy to a lot of conversations, obviously, and hand wringing and people worried about their retirement plans and things like that, and honestly, the issue is very different conference to conference in the United Methodist Church, and the conference I was part of was very progressive. So there were no issues in terms of I could have officiated gay weddings. I could have done whatever, but it was by no means homogenous. I mean, there were people with a variety of opinions within that conference and a lot of tension. And so it's pretty ugly.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking because I have a sort of tangential connection to the Methodist Church. I was very heavily involved with the Walk to Emmaus years and years ago, and have worked on many of the. But our community of Walk to Emmaus folks, I've found over the years to be a little unique in that it was very ecumenical, and so it was always a big mixture of everyone from Catholic to fundamentalist Christians to, obviously Methodists. And so I have a soft spot in my heart. You know what I mean? Like theologically too, if you put a gun to my head and make me choose Wesley or Calvin, I'm going Wesley every day, right? Calvin can get bent. I got issues with Wesley, but nowhere near the issues I have with the other guy. But I still feel about it. Maybe you can speak to this before we get jumping in the book. I still feel about the Methodist Church the way I feel about any other institutional church, and that the institution has taken over. And so much of time and energy and resources are taken up with the sustaining of this massive structure.
Oh my gosh.
And it just gets, and you don't even see, people are not inside of that institution won't notice it. But when you go to talk about the church splitting like this is going to split, this is not your local non-denominational church down the street having a church split. This is going to be a massive
billions and billions of dollars in assets. Yeah.
It's super complicated, right? It's going to take teams of lawyers to untangle these people from, like you said, retirement plans and who owns church property and any number of 100 other things. And then obviously the ties to different seminaries and who's going to be part of what conference. And
exactly,
it's going to be, so to me, that sort of, it's going to be a bummer for those inside of it. I feel bad for them. But if that doesn't underscore the problem with massive, massive church structures, maybe if nothing else, we'll go, maybe this wasn't such a great plan. I don't know.
Yeah. And I think, I think you're onto something that in terms of organizational structures by their nature are self-preserving, and they have to be. And one of the things I think that surprised me, I came from a real conservative, borderline fundamentalist denomination into the Methodist Church. And I remember saying to somebody at one point, liberal fundamentalism isn't a whole lot funner than conservative fundamentalism. I mean,
amen, brother. Fundamentalism is crap either way, right?
It really is. And they just had different things that they were fundamentalist about. And, it took me a while to kind of dig through it to find them, but they were definitely there.
Yeah. And they're just as dogmatic, right?
They can be, yeah.
And they tend to defend those things as virulently as anybody else does. Mm-hmm. Can be just as vitriolic in their defense. I've found that to be true. I don't do the whataboutism, where like like there's good people on both sides. But I think they're similar to a degree. I would still lean more progressive than conservative, just because. But I have seen friends of mine who dare to buck, even that trend and have suffered the consequences of that.
Well, I think you said it without knowing you said it. And I think there's become a difference between what we consider liberal theology and progressive theology.
That's true. That's true.
I think as some of us are moving, farther in our deconstruction, we no longer are comfortable with this conservative liberal idea, because they both get stuck in their ideology. And this idea of progressive theology is something that's like, it's constantly progressing. It's constantly moving. And that is, if it ever becomes a movement, it's a problem. But as long as it's moving and working towards, reconciliation, it's working towards how we can work together as community, I will stay within a progressive movement. And then I go using the movement again.
And confessing traditions tend to be that way. It's like we have our thing that we have to defend, and this is our list of things that we're gonna go to the mat for. Whereas if you create a system, a methodology of doing theology, then it becomes always progressive. And what's ironic is that John Wesley was exactly that sort of, hence the name Methodist. He was the creator of a method of, of how we do theology, how we think about the world, how we think about ourselves in relation to the world. And yet his followers, of course, don't always do that, but don't we just like Jesus followers,
right? We do that all the time, don't we? We're like, listen, I'm sure Wesley would spit in his grave on some levels if he saw what has become, right? Because like you said, he was not, in my understanding of John Wesley, was that he was like you said, he wasn't necessarily trying to formulate, the 12 doctrinal points of Methodism. It was, hey, let's talk about how we work through these things, which should mean that it continues to progress even beyond him, right?
Right.
And even, I rarely throw John Calvin a bone, but neo-Calvinists are way more Calvinist than Calvin ever was. Like they have taken Calvin, and don't get me wrong, I think a lot of what Calvin said was abhorrent, right? There's stuff with him that I violently disagree with. But I think some of the new versions of Calvinisms, the John Pipers, cue the kicked puppy of the world, and there's others who hold, carry that banner. Man, they've taken it so far. Like
the neo-Calvinist stuff is,
it drives me up a wall. John, we have a running joke inside of this podcast that every time John Piper's name is mentioned, a puppy gets kicked. So, and then so Eric's going to have to insert a couple of you hope so, because I just, and every time I think the guy can't get any deeper, and I don't even think it's always him, but there's a Desiring God Twitter account and podcast, whatever, and every time I think I've found the bottom, something else he'll tweet something else and go,
just keep digging.
Oh my God, you got a shovel, then you got you just doubled down, tripled down, quadrupled down. And he's always doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on seemingly, to me, how bad God can be, and we still call him good. Like if God kills me, he's loving me, which is the last one I just ripped him apart for. No matter what God does, he's good. He's loving me no matter what. If he causes me illness, he's loving me. If he takes my life, he's loving me. I'm like, okay, I pray for your wife and kids, man. Like, it's a toxic relationship. But anyway, we digress. So,
again, there we go.
Let's talk about the book, man. Let's get to the knot. First of all, I think that's a topic. I don't know. I'm interested to see your take on this, but I feel like rather than, with the exception of how-to books and, 10 steps to a better marriage, and there aren't a lot of books written about marriage, I think, from your perspective, which is, so let's just maybe give us the overall premise and let's talk about some of the points that you make in the book.
Yeah. Once I finished the book, I realized there's a lot of marriage books out there. I had no idea how many, especially.
And they're all bad. I'm sorry. They're all bad.
Well, how many of them aren't self-help books though? I mean,
that's what, let me clarify. The ones that are self-help books, right? That are just like that are literally trying to make your marriage better.
Yeah. Here's a formula. Just plug into this formula and you'll have it all figured out. Yeah.
Like we're all the exact same people. Like our lives and our marriages all fit into this cookie cutter idea of marriage, which is the first mistake of these books.
So you finish this book though and you realize, holy crap, there's a plethora of marriage books out there, right?
Yeah. Well, when I got on the Amazon page and it has on there other books you might like, and I'm thinking, no, this is nothing like I've got. I would not like this, but
right.
But to answer your question, I started. It's funny that my journey in this started a few years back. Somebody recommended a book to me by a woman named Stephanie Kuntz. She's a historian at Evergreen College in Washington State. And she wrote a book called Marriage: A History. She's just a secular historian, but she just found the whole institution interesting. And so she traced the marriage from really the agricultural revolution to today and how it's sort of evolved, how it's changed. And once I finished that book, it was sort of a light bulb moment for me that most of what we talk about as, especially in evangelical circles, as traditional marriage really has only been around for a couple hundred years.
Yeah.
And the way the scriptures understood marriage is very different than the way we understand it today. And, we try to read back into, everybody does this, but, evangelicals in particular with marriage, try to read back into marriage, our marriages now into the scriptures. But when you take a pretty close look, it doesn't match up very well. And so for most of human history, marriage was about survival. It was about trying to get food on the table and a roof over your head. And people married to create political alliances. People married to sort of help get more farm hands around the farm. People married in order to create alliances between tribes or villages. Nobody really married for love. If you happen to fall in love with your spouse, that's great. That would be fantastic. But romantic love anyway, wasn't really the impetus for marriage for most of human history until about 200 years ago. And it wasn't until about 200 years ago that people began to think, maybe I know better than my entire family of who I should marry rather than my family. And so marriage, as we understand it today, is a sharp left turn from most of human history. And so when evangelicals talk about traditional marriage, what they really are talking about is 1950s marriage. They're not really talking. They're not talking about traditional marriage in which women were property and we had no choice in who we married, and sex and marriage were completely separate things, and love and marriage were often very separate things as well. There's sort of a thinking in a lot of human history that you don't want to fall in love with your spouse because marriage is just too important to actually have a romantic relationship with this person. You should have a romantic relationship with somebody else, and so Stephanie Kuhn's book really was eye-opening to me, and it began me to really thinking about, set off in my mind, I guess, trying to re-envision that. Okay, if marriage is really much more pliable than I first thought, that means it can change again, right? I mean, it doesn't have to stay the way it is now. What would it look like to reimagine marriage going into the future then, instead of, trying to create more Leave It to Beaver, sort of families.
Yeah.
And so that was, I guess, what drove me into the book. But again, the minute you start talking about this, in some institutions, it can get you into a lot of trouble. So once I was no longer in ministry, I started writing these thoughts down and processing them. And I think that kind of brought it out quite a bit. So
it's a very prominent topic right now, right? Specifically within the religious right and the conservative Republicans, of this idea of we need to get back to traditional marriages, right? I mean, even Candace
or biblical marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Biblical marriage. But what's
what
her
the
name?
hell does that even mean?
Candace Cameron Bure, right? Leaving Hallmark, God forbid, but she did, so she could start her own network to do Christmas movies that portray the traditional marriage, the traditional relationships, and biblical, right? Which is what she's saying, but she's not saying. But then you begin to ask, it's like, which biblical marriage are you talking about?
Yeah.
Are you talking about Solomon? Are you talking
polygamy,
about?
or are we talking?
Are you talking about David? Are you talking about? I mean, Adam and Eve. Just going back to Adam and Eve within the Bible, you have to recognize that there could be no traditional marriage there because there are no people, right? So,
wouldn't they be the founding traditional marriage?
Right, which is apparently incestual, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it has to be.
Hey, there's just the one woman. Yeah, she's yours. Go.
Yeah. So,
yeah, the whole literalism thing there really gets really messy quick.
Right. Yeah. And then, because then these Bible literalists have to really work around this, right? Because
they do mental gymnastics.
Yeah, they're mental gymnastics to make it seem logical and okay in our day and age is astronomical. I mean, it's amazing what they were able to do.
Yeah, a big deal in the Hebrew scriptures was the Levirate marriage, which essentially was if a man died, then his brother had to take his wife and kids on, right? And if he was unwilling to do that, he had to meet before the city council or the town council and give a good reason why that he shouldn't, marry this woman. And the thinking was, and again, if you in the mindset of this, it makes sense. You want to ensure the lineage of your family going forward. You don't want somebody else to marry her and then claim the family's inheritance. And so this was the major concern. There were economic concerns involved with all of this. So in that context, it made some sense, even though we may not value those same things that they did, but it wasn't completely absurd.
Yeah.
But I don't think we'd endorse that kind of thing today. We're not really into that kind of thing.
Well, no, because we've hyper spiritualized marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So as you're running through these ideas of marriage, it seems to me if we would untether this institution, right, from all of its inherent, at least current spiritual implications, we could look at it more pragmatically, and there would be room for marriage as a concept to evolve and meet the current need, right?
Right. Yeah. And so in the book, part of a couple of things I thought were surprising. One, when I read Stephanie Kuhn's book, one of the things that really surprised me was that the church really never got involved in marriages until like the 16th century. And in fact, Martin Luther thought, churches shouldn't be involved in marriages at all, and it wasn't really till, like the 16th, 17th century that priests and ministers began to oversee weddings. Before that, it was completely a civil thing. And so we have this sort of notion that like for centuries, this has all been tied into that the church and marriage have had this partnership, but that really hasn't been the case. And so the institution itself, again, in the book, I kind of appropriate Jesus' words when he says, people were made for the Sabbath, not Sabbath for people. We can say that of any institution.
Yeah,
that people are made for, that people are made for marriage, not marriage for people. That marriage isn't the thing that's sacred. People are the thing that's sacred.
Right.
And when we get those things flipped, it's like the institutional conversation we had a minute ago about, how institutions become these things that overpower our lives. They take on a life of their own. When we end up serving the institution, we get it all backwards. The institution is designed to serve us. Not vice versa.
Yeah, exactly.
And so the same is true with marriage. When we end up serving the institution of marriage instead of it serving us, we've got it all backwards.
Well, yeah, and out of that is birthed all kinds of toxic stuff, right? Because the evangelical churches that John and I were raised in, mostly non-denominational, but very fundamentalist in some regards, marriage was borderline divinized, like it was sacrosanct. Which meant that when that at all costs, people stayed inside of unhealthy marriages because the institution was more important than the people inside of those institutions. So we had, I can tell you of dozens of people that I knew that are like my parents' contemporaries who wore it as a badge of honor to some degree that they stayed in really unhealthy marriages that were bad for them and bad for their kids and created generations of trauma because they were so committed to the ideal of marriage that they could not see how unhealthy it was for them. And, I think that's one of the dangers of institution is that, we lose sight of the fact that institutions are meant to serve us and not the other way around. And that doesn't mean that people can't stay in marriages forever and be happy and healthy. I think it can happen.
Sure. Oh, for sure. Yeah.
But, when I, as a pastor, when women would come or men for that matter would come and seek counsel about their marriages that were like if a woman was being abused, my first advice was get the hell out.
Yeah.
And that maybe not the church party line, and they would sometimes go, what do you mean? I'm like, you don't have to take that. God never intended for you to be someone's punching bag just to serve some idealized version of marriage that you have to stay inside of. Defend yourself, defend your kids, preserve your life. But yeah, I think that's that. But do you find then that our sort of 21st century notion of marriage then is anachronistic, right? When we sort of read our sensibilities into an ancient text and go, well, that's what Jesus meant when he said that a man would leave his mother and father and cleave to his wife. And this thing that now that seems very anachronistic to me.
Yeah, and I'm not sure even how much we're accurately reading into the text. I was really surprised when I started this project. I went through and read every passage in the New Testament on marriage and was kind of struck by how few of them there really are.
There's not many, right?
There's really not that much. Yeah. And when you look at Jesus' words, he's got things like, who are my brother and who is my mother and who is my sister? He has all this deconstruction of family systems and lack of respect for marriage and family that you wouldn't expect, an evangelical wouldn't expect. And in fact, at one point his disciples say, well, man, sounds like it's better just not even be married at all. And Jesus kind of says, yeah, that's probably a good idea,
Yeah. And Paul carries that on, right? And says basically.
Exactly. Paul says the same thing.
Like, if you don't need to, don't. If you're married, stay married. If you're not married, don't get married.
Yeah, what are you guys getting all married for, And the one time he kind of gives some, a little bit of direction of like, here's how a marriage should kind of look like. At the end of it, he says, this is all my opinion. Don't even take this as divine, kind of thing.
Right.
So, I mean, again, it's really surprising when you actually go back and look at it, how almost anti-marriage the New Testament is and how little they talk about it. And even Jesus' teaching on divorce only comes about because people are trying to trap him in his answers.
Well, isn't that the place where, because as he speaks about divorce, isn't that where his disciples are like, well, then why even get married?
Yeah,
because
he's
much. Like he's upending even their opinion of how marriage works, right? And he's so they're like looking at his deconstruction, you might say, of the idea of marriage, and they're like, well, if that's the way marriage is, why even do it? Because you've taken away all my power as a man over a woman.
But if you study a little bit into marriage in first century Second Temple Judaism, there was this practice amongst those folks of men not divorcing their wives, but putting them away, which was the euphemism for basically leaving your wife, but not giving her a certificate of divorce, which meant that she was relegated to second class citizenship. She couldn't remarry because she didn't have a divorce decree. That's why a lot of those women end up in prostitution and just trying to find ways to survive because their husbands didn't have the class to divorce them. They quote unquote put them away. And so I think Jesus was giving them a legal out, right, to say, listen, if this is the way this is going to go, then issue your wife a decree of divorce. But again, if you're not approaching that text with an understanding of what marriage looked like in the first century, and you're imposing 20th and 21st century sensibilities onto it, you'll miss the boat, right? I mean, historically, you'll miss it.
Yeah, completely, yeah.
So, as an institution, what's your position then on how it might or could evolve as we move forward? Then, if we're going to unshackle it from the past.
Yeah. So in the book, I talk about, the theological framework I kind of put around it is I take the saying from architecture, form follows function, and so in architecture, you always talk about, the form a building should take, a structure should be a reflection on its intent or its purpose. And so the same is true with any institution, including a marriage, social construct like marriage. The form a marriage takes, what a marriage should look like, should be a reflection on its intention. And hopefully the intention is love. Hopefully the intention is the well-being of the people in it or the well-being of the community at large. And if that's your intention, then the form is incidental then, because really what you're going for is the function. And this is how we get legalistic sort of understandings of the world. People who are really legalistic talk a lot about forms. We talk about rules and regulations and things we can and can't do. When we all know that's just the cheapest form of ethics, the rule following, that you can follow all the rules and still be an asshole, and
true. And probably will be one.
Yeah. It doesn't guarantee you're necessarily doing the right thing. And so when form follows function, we quit asking the question of like, what's the best form of marriage? Instead we ask the question, what kind of marriage creates the most loving environments and most healthy relationships, creates the most empowerment for the people involved in it. And that's different. There's no cut and dry answer for that. There's no formula for that. There's no self-help book that's going to tell you what the answer is going to be for you and for your partner, because you're different. Everybody's different. They have different backgrounds. They have different families of origin. They have different life experiences. They have different places and times in life. Form and function, works. We know this intuitively. If you have kids, you understand this. You love your kids. That's the constant. That's the function of your life. You want your kids to do well. You want them to be happy. You want them to thrive in life. But the way in which you love them in order towards that goal is always changing. That form of love is always changing. sometimes you love your kids by giving them a hug. Sometimes you love your kids by giving them a swift kick in the pants and some correction. Sometimes you love your kids by giving them $20. That's what they need. Sometimes, you love your kids by encouraging them. There's just a million ways that you love your kids. The intent is always the same, is love, thriving, well-being, helping them thrive in the world. But what that expression looks like is always changing. It's always evolving and looking different in different contexts. And that's the same. That's the same with a marriage too.
Yeah, it always sort of struck me as weird too, because when you think about, and I don't know the history, I'm not a historian, but I have read and heard things like there's a point at which the government gets involved in marriage because of its perceived benefits to culture and society, right? So they begin to say the government begins to incentivize marriage because it settles people, right? It puts them into a place where they need to settle down and earn a living and become productive. So it kind of helps to solidify society. It always struck me as weird that they didn't want that for the gay community. Who they always painted as being sort of wild and promiscuous, and they have all these caricatures for the gay community. They're out there. Why would you not want to help settle that group of people down then, and begin to incentivize their joining into loving monogamous relationships that are family oriented, and because at that point their prejudice outweighs all of their practicality. Like, this practically seems like a very smart move. We should have legalized gay marriage a long time ago, rather than fight it culturally because we're so threatened by it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I don't know. It just strikes me as weird. We always used to joke around. We used to, joke about we wanted to legalize gay marriage because why shouldn't they have the right to be as miserable as the rest of us? I mean, but that's not fair. I'm not miserable. I've been married 31, almost 32 years, and I'm, and I wouldn't change a thing. I'm happy about that. But my views towards how does this affect then your view towards people's marriages that maybe end? Because it used to be, for me, that was it was one of the ultimate tragedies, and even when it happened fairly amicably and two people just decided, this isn't working for us anymore. And we love each other enough to go, we're going to find our best selves someplace outside of this union. And they sort of set each other free to go pursue their best lives. And then people sit around and mourn that loss as though it's a death. I'm not sure what your take on that would be, but there's no easy answers on that. I think one of the things that's interesting as marriages evolved, I mean, obviously when a person's lifespan was, if you're expected to live to be 35 to 40 years old, when you said till death do us part, as in your wedding vows, it had a lot different meaning than when, you're going to live to be 85 or 90, and, you're making a whole different commitment, That's a good point. That's true.
So I think that's one of the things, as marriages evolved. I mean, again, it's just different now that, if you're going to commit to 60 years with somebody, I mean, you better really like this person,
Well, and, given how much I know I've changed, I'm 51 years old.
Exactly.
I'm not even remotely the same person. In fact, I can't even. There's times when my teens and 20s seem like that was not only another lifetime ago, but a whole nother person. And that's great when people can evolve together, and if relationships are healthy. I think they can. My wife and I have changed together over the years, but that's created conflict as we've at some point in our lives looked up and went, "You are not the same person I married. Now, I'm not the same person you married. Do you still like me?" That's a reality, though, that I think, again, when we begin to prioritize the institution over the human beings inside of them, there's not that room for that. I think sometimes that honest assessment, and again, I'm not advocating for people to willy-nilly ditch their marriages. I don't think any of that should be undertaken lightly. But at the same time, I don't know. My current view is I prioritize human beings over idealized institutions.
And it's just hard. And, as, in my years as a pastor, you meet couples all the time where, one person has grown and evolved and become, over the years. And the other person, they just like to sit by the pool and look at their iPhone, I mean, they're completely happy with it. And you think, how can this sustain? I mean, if you're not going to grow together, it's hard. There's not an easy answer to that, and everybody's kind of got to work through that on their own. And sometimes, again, when you start talking about abuse and neglect and those sorts of things, I mean, there's sometimes where divorce is the best of a lot of bad options. All the options are bad, and maybe divorce is the best of the bad ones. And sometimes that's the case, unfortunately.
Well, if you think about how many people enter into marriage, like most of us did, John and I were pretty young. I was 19, man. What the hell did I know?
Yeah.
I think I could have been excused for entering into a lifelong legally binding contract without even 2% of the information I needed to go forward with it. I tell my kids all the time, just because your mom and I did this and it has seemed to work out does not mean this is what I would necessarily recommend for everybody. We were too young. We were too dumb. And just stubborn enough, you know what I mean, to stick it out.
There's a pretty tight correlation between how young a person gets married and the divorce rate. In fact, it was one of the most interesting pieces of research I stumbled on in this when I was researching this book. There used to be a thing that evangelicals used to say, well, the divorce rate among evangelicals is just as high as the world's. But what I discovered actually is that evangelicals have a higher divorce rate than the average population. And when you dig a little deeper into the data, what you find is that the reason that they have a higher divorce rate is that they marry so young. And the reason they marry so young is because they want to have sex. And so those things just all kind of fit together in a line. Kids want to have sex. The only way to do that is to say these wedding vows. Okay, I'll do that, and next thing you know, they're in a marriage and it doesn't do very well when you get married that young, generally.
Well, I mean, it also, there's been this whole idea that specifically within the evangelical church, specifically within the purity culture, that no one really dates, right? We don't want them to date. Because dating leads to premarital sex leads to pregnancy outside of marriage, blah, 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 right? So we don't want them dating. So we ultimately set up a scenario where they never really get to know the person that they ultimately marry. So they're going into this idea of marriage blind. They don't really know the person because they're not allowed to date. They're doing these they go on their church outings together where they're strongly monitored. They're not allowed
Don't worry, John. There's ways around that, man.
Well, yeah, but even in that, it's considered so taboo that then you're doing it more out of rebellion, right? So then your relationship is a rebellious relationship, which turns into a rebellious marriage, which doesn't seem that healthy to me.
Yeah, where's that book of the author of that book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, Josh Harris.
Who has actually denounced it, right? He's denounced that book.
Yeah, he's super apologetic about it.
And denounced Christian faith.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. But that was such an influence on so many people, this idea we're going to court instead of marry. And, and of course, the idea of courtship was your families got together, and made these decisions for you, which I'm not sure we want to go back to. I think we want to move into the future instead of, back into the past in this. But
it's such a weird thing, though. I was a youth pastor in a lot of that time, right? And so I have some very cringy remembrances of conversations, and I've raised kids in this culture too. So, when my oldest daughter was in the 8th grade, she and this boy who was a friend of the son of a family friend, they decided they liked each other and they wanted to start dating. And so the families got together and discussed, the parameters of this dating scenario. Not so much me, but the kid's dad was really big on this. And so we literally had this really cringy sit down in my living room talking about what we would allow, how we would allow them to interact with one another and, preserve both of their purity and make sure they didn't go too far. I'm like, they're in the 8th grade. They want to go watch a movie. I'm not saying, that their hormones aren't raised and they won't try whatever. But, and then, not too long after they started dating, this kid's father came to my house and broke up with my daughter for his son. The most fucked up conversation I have ever been a part of. I'm like, you're kidding me. you're breaking up with my daughter. You're a 45-year-old dude. Like, tell your son to get his ass over here and break up with her like a man. But no, his dad came over and it was horrifying, dude.
Tell his dad, tell your kid to grow up. And that's all part of growing up. That's all part of that learning process. Of course it's hard.
But the kid didn't want to break up. That was the thing, though. The kid didn't want to break up with my daughter. He wanted his kid to break up with my daughter. He decided to shut it down.
Oh, my God.
Because, and again, that if I could put sort of purity culture, on blast, it would be with that story. Right? Because and what you said a little while ago, that's sort of then one of the direct consequences, negative consequences of purity culture that we've shoved down these kids' throats are probably an entire generation or two of really bad marriages that we have kind of borderline, if not coerced, forced them into because we've demonized sex to the point where anything that happens outside of marriage is evil and bad. And so their sexuality is repressed. Their sexual identities don't ever get fully formed.
Yeah.
It's just a mess. We've created a generation of broken people on some level who they don't even know how to lay claim or a hold of their own sexuality because it's all tied up inside of this other religious dogma, right?
And God forbid that it's something beyond this idea of having sex outside of marriage and it be something that you have a same-sex attraction, because that's a whole other level of...
that's adding trauma on top of trauma.
Right. And the church is ill-prepared at best to even remotely address that.
Yeah, but willfully so.
Oh, yeah, willfully, yes. They have willfully made themselves ignorant.
They don't want to know, But yeah, that's that. So you address purity culture in the book, right?
Oh yeah, and and what I say in the book is I think purity culture is one of those really interesting things, especially once I walked away from evangelicalism, where I look back and think, man, that was messed up. I mean, when you think about the fact that for 1800 years of church history, we had this sort of notion of what it meant to be a virtuous person, that was really based on the life and teachings of Jesus. Do you care for the marginalized, the oppressed, the hungry? Do you feed the hungry? Do you clothe the naked? Do you care about widows and orphans? Do you do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God? I mean, those were the ways that we sort of measured what it meant to be a virtuous person, for 1800 years. And then all of a sudden we took all that and threw it out the window and said, no, the way you measure whether or not you're a virtuous person is by your private passions, that so long as you keep your pants on, you're a good person, and that really allowed us, frankly, it's much easier to keep your pants on than to feed the hungry.
Oh, much easier.
It's just way, way easier. And the bonus part of that is that you can be self-righteous in your attitude towards everybody else who can't keep their pants on.
Right.
Yeah. So it's this double win for self-righteousness. And all of a sudden we make this hard left turn in church history where we, in purity culture, where we begin to measure purity and our righteousness solely based on private passions. And it just has messed us up to no end. And it's diabolical. It really is. It's really twisted.
Yeah. Well, I've always wondered too, because there seems to be this other shift that takes place within Christendom where we pivot towards sort of an individualistic notion of salvation, right? Now it's my personal relationship with God. This is about my individual. So now I'm not part of some corporate entity that's trying to do better. Right. Mm-hmm. Now it's all about my individual purity, my individual piety, how well I observe the rules, how well I color inside the lines. When John and I were coming up in youth groups and churches as kids, I can't even tell you if I ever heard a sermon from a youth pastor or even from our senior pastors about our responsibilities to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, do anything beyond. It was always about how we were to conduct ourselves in accordance with some set of arbitrary holiness codes. And so we were force-fed a diet of like, look, we're supposed to be separate from the world in this way. And that was always like, we didn't go to R-rated movies. We didn't participate in these sort of pop culture things. We didn't listen to secular music. We didn't dress a certain way. We certainly didn't, have sex with, anybody ever until we were married. But yeah, you're right. But that's that pivot, right? Of that's easier to contain. It's also easier to quantify if people are doing it versus this other sort of more ethereal thing.
Right. You know what's interesting? When you were talking, it reminded me of I've done some work in Africa. I'm part of this group that does economic development projects in Africa, and one of the countries we've worked in is Rwanda. And the thing I discovered about Rwanda, and this is super interesting to me. So, of course, they had the big genocide in Rwanda. Rwanda was like the big success story for evangelical missions in Africa for years and years. Well, look at all the great things we've done, all these evangelicals we've made in Rwanda. Then they had the genocide. And then you think to yourself, is this the product of what we create, that evangelicalism created in Africa, So when the Rwandan government reformed after the genocide, one of the things they did was they said, okay, all these missionaries and all these church work and everything, you have to register your church with the government, which of course freaks out us Americans. But here's what they said. And when you register your church with the government, we want to know from you, what is it that you're going to do to serve the community? Because if you're not going to serve the community, you will not get a permit from the government to open a church.
You know what? I'm down with that. Can we do that here?
Yeah,
you will no longer be allowed to open a church unless you can tell me your plan to serve your community.
Isn't that crazy? I mean,
serve yourself.
And so it's a whole different mindset in the churches there. They all have like these little foundations that are these little projects that they're working on, and I thought, this isn't all bad.
Yeah, but I think you're right. That begs the question, does it not? Though that there's some study needs to be done on that. I wonder how much of that did contribute to what happened in Rwanda, because so much of what's interesting is you go into a country and into a culture that's very tribal, and then you introduce even more sort of tribal ideals, because Christianity can become very tribal, and you just give them more reasons to hate people they don't like already. And now you've actually given them more rationale to marginalize other people. And violence is the inevitable outcome of all of it, I think. And maybe in a place like the United States, that might be somewhat contained and curtailed just by our own culture. But man, I don't know.
It'd be a good doctoral dissertation for somebody, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it really would be. I need to get a hold of any of my historian friends out there who want an interesting field of study. That would be interesting. And we may be completely off course. Who knows? Maybe one doesn't have to do the other. But I don't think reasonable.
I don't think you're that far off course, and I think you're being a little bit too optimistic. I think we aren't as under control in this country as we'd like to be, and I think.
Yeah, I should have put that in quotes, but we haven't had a massive, machete swinging genocide. So that's what I mean by sort of contained.
Yeah, it's a good thing we don't have a lot of guns in this country. Right, otherwise, we'd be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, because the incidences of violence that we do have tend to be, they are isolated somewhat. They're big and splashy. That dude walks into the gay nightclub in where was that recently, John?
Colorado Springs.
Colorado Springs, and opens fire in the back, in a part of the world where focus on the family is, they live in the shadow of that thing. And here's an organization that has preached nothing but quote unquote traditional family values. They have spoken out loudly and openly against the gay community. And the result of that, I think you can draw a direct line towards somebody who decides to take matters into his own hands and go, rid the world of some people he finds abhorrent. So I think they got blood on their hands. Well, I don't think, I know they have blood on their hands, but
I think a lot of that then moves towards this idea of marriage too, that specifically with the religious right, the ultra conservatives, the evangelical fundamentalists who are saying we need to get back to these traditional biblical values of family, which honestly is that the wife stays quiet, that she does not speak out about the abuse that her husband is putting her through, verbally or physically. That's the traditional values. This idea of going, make America great again, back to the 1950s. I don't think there's a single woman who, if she was really intellectually honest, would ever want to go back to that. I just don't. I don't see it.
I would bet that most people who say, let's go back there, were never there. And so they have an idealized idea of what that looked like.
Yeah, they have
they were, or they're white males who pined for the days when their power was unchecked.
Right.
And their privilege was on full display. But go ahead, sir. You had something to say, man.
Well, I was going to say, one of the research things I stumbled on in the book was they did a survey of college-age women and asked them, if you had a choice between being in a traditional marriage, meaning 1950s marriage, or not being married at all, which would you pick? And 85% of them said, I'd just rather not be married.
So they're getting smarter.
I was going to say, the market's getting smaller and smaller for these guys, for our neo-Calvinist friends. Looking for these.
I've seen their profiles on dating websites. The pool's already pretty small, man. Like I'm the head of the household. If you want to date me, you're gonna fall in line. Yeah, you're gonna find a lot of women that way, dude. Yeah, I don't know. It's such a weird thing. But so beyond the issues of marriage, traditional versus, and then purity culture. Give me one more juicy topic that the book jumps into, man.
Oh man. Well, of course I got a whole chapter on sex. So that's the really juicy stuff.
But are there sex robots, John? Sorry, we had another guest on a few weeks ago. We talked about sex robots. It was great.
Sex robots. That was outside the scope of this book.
But when you do the second edition and you add
sequel,
you could do like an additional chapter or like an appendix or something. Yeah, that'd be great. Talk about sex robots. So the whole chapter on sex, that's great.
Yeah. Sort of the idea that the general idea is that, and I actually got this from a John Ortberg sermon years ago. He did a really nice job of laying this out. He talks about human beings tend to, in terms of sexuality, we think of ourselves either as angels or animals. So the animals extreme, of course, is hey, we're just mammals and we've got impulses and hormones and, just do what you got to do. And, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas kind of thing. And then the angel's perspective is sort of the other extreme when we pretend, because of purity culture, we pretend like we're not sexual beings at all and that we don't have sexual desires. And neither one of those extremes is healthy. And, in fact, both can be very destructive, especially, actually, probably the angel's perspective could be just as destructive or more destructive than the animal's perspective. But yeah, so seeing human sexuality as something that's vital and important and crucial to human thriving, but not seeing us either like as animals either, because we're not that either. So.
Well, how do you see this progressing with like the next generations coming? So, my brother had the privilege of actually officiating my daughter's wedding on October 1st, so not too long ago, and there were some interesting moments in that wedding that I've been married also for over 30 years. So things that were not even questioned on how they would happen in my wedding with my wife. My wife would take my name, right? That's just mm-hmm. how it happens. Mm-hmm. There was very specific things that would happen within that wedding ceremony. And even ours was a non-religious ceremony to be honest. So there was not a lot of faith-based information, but it still followed the traditional marriage, right? So my daughter's, when she gets married, her now husband took her name. That was one of the biggest changes that I saw, within this next generation of people. And then, I honestly didn't feel comfortable giving my daughter away. So I had a conversation with Nat, on the day of the wedding. It's like, I'm not giving her away, but I still want you to ask. I want you to ask the question, who gives this woman to this man? Which gave my daughter permission to say, I do. It's me. I'm not someone's property. I'm not owned by anybody. Right. I'm making this decision to get to enter into this marriage. So what do you see as the next generation of people who are looking at marriage and how it's going to work? Do you see any major changes? Or do you see that it's just going to be like a culmination of traditional marriage with some like modern ideas added to it?
Yeah, I agree with your observations. I think that these younger generations are very much, they got a real low tolerance for patriarchy. And so all those traditional marriage things, and I had that stuff too, when I was officiating weddings, where couples would say, what's this give this away? Who's giving whose property of what? This is weird. And they'd want, which I encourage them to rework and think through that. That's one of the vestiges for sure of truly traditional marriage. But yeah, I think, I have adult kids, they're in their 20s and, they're all dating and not a single one of them's married, and my oldest just turned 30 and I'm like, I'd like grandkids at some point, they're just waiting, which is not all bad, but the kids are getting married much, much later than our generation did for sure. And, that's probably not all bad. And then, they're like you say, they're negotiating sort of their own expectations in marriage as well. A lot of them have seen some pretty bad marriages, and they don't want to repeat that stuff or be a part of something that's unhealthy. And so good for them.
I've got 4 adult kids. Three of them are married. One is currently shacking up, and more power to them. That doesn't bother me in the least. It would have 10 years ago. It would have been like, what are you doing? You're killing your mother. But they all got married later than I did. My one son, like, literally did the only advice I ever gave him about marriage was like, listen, like, get through college first, man. Because he had goals, and I'm like, don't subordinate your goals to this. You know what I mean? And he did that. He actually met his wife his senior year of college, and they got married after she graduated. But their approach to this has been very different than mine, and I think part of it's because, they saw the struggles that their mom and I had over the years, not having our careers set and struggling financially. And, that brings a lot of pressure, and creates tension in the family. But I've also given them a lot of room to pursue this in their own way, and my youngest son is currently living with his girlfriend, and, it is what it is. I don't have a feeling about it one way or the other. I love her. I love him. If they ever decide to get married, great. But my attitudes toward marriage are much different than they were 30 years ago, and I don't see it as idealized as much as I used to. And I certainly don't see it as the end all be all for everybody. So I kind of take it like Paul does and be like, you know what? If you want to get married, get married. If you don't. No harm, no foul. But so yeah, I appreciate you taking on all these topics. It's great. To me, it's an approach to this that has not been done enough of. So I appreciate you doing it.
Yeah. It's been fun for sure.
Giving us a book that's not a self-help 12-step program to, or another book about someone's love languages. That's great. So yeah.
Really.
Make sure and check it out if you are listening to this. If you've made it this far, and John and I haven't run you off, buy the book. The Knot it's great. I think it's going to be revolutionary for you guys in a lot of ways. And we'll make sure and link to all your other stuff, your social media if you have it, and websites and Facebooks and TikToks, and make sure people have you on Tinder. And wait a minute, that's don't look him up. I'm joking. If you need to buy real estate, though, I hear he sells real estate too, though, so that might help you if you're in Arizona. He can hook you up with something. But man, I appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us.
It was really a lot of fun. It was great to meet you guys virtually.
Absolutely,
and, really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for taking time.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.